If you want to measure a country's power today, don't look at its army, look at its bonds. Stock markets decide faster than battlefields. Central banks are as powerful as generals. Where did this logic come from? The answer lies hidden in a city that never had an army: Venice. Money doesn't speak, history speaks. And history tells us this: real power comes not from owning land, but from building trust. Throughout history, power followed a simple rule: land, army, crown. Venice completely broke this rule. It had no king, no farmland, no knights guarding borders, only water, mud, and wooden stakes driven into the lagoon. Yet for centuries, emperors, popes, crusaders, and kings remained dependent on Venice, not for soldiers, for something far more dangerous: money. Not gold, not coins, trust. Venice didn't conquer the world, it financed it, and in the process it quietly invented the financial system we live in today. The rest of Europe was built on land. Land meant farms, farms meant peasants, peasants meant food, taxes, and soldiers. Power flowed from land to sword, from sword to crown. Venice couldn't play this game. In the middle of a shallow lagoon, it was spread across small islands, no fields to tax, no castles to defend, no cavalry to deploy. The feudalism that defined medieval Europe didn't work there. Venice did something radical. It built power on movement, ships instead of fields, contracts instead of castles, ports instead of borders. From the beginning, Venice survived by connecting others' economies. Goods from the Islamic world, spices from Asia, silk from China, metal and wool from Europe. All passed through Venetian hands. The city became a hinge between worlds that didn't trust each other, had different religions, didn't even share currencies. This made Venice valuable. More importantly, it made it indispensable. In most of medieval Europe, merchants were low on the social ladder. They didn't fight. They didn't pray professionally. They made money, which made them useful, but morally suspect. Venice never developed that class structure. There was no landowning aristocracy to dominate politics. The people who owned ships, organized trade, managed risk weren't outsiders climbing up. They were the hierarchy itself. From the start, Venice's elite were merchants, families who understood logistics, capital, and long-term planning. Success didn't come from inherited land. It came from competence, surviving storms, honoring contracts, delivering goods on time in hostile waters. In Venice, economic skill wasn't shameful. It was proof of worth. This cultural difference mattered more than any law. Because when merchants aren't socially inferior, they don't have to hide their wealth. They can invest it directly in ships, infrastructure, and institutions. In 1297, with the Serrata del Maggior Concilio, closing of the Great Council, the system hardened. Membership in Venice's governing body was restricted to certain families, not warrior nobles, but established merchant dynasties. Political power was hereditary, yes, but merchant power was hereditary. Venice didn't create an aristocracy of blood. It created an aristocracy of balance sheets. Money doesn't speak, history speaks. And history shows us that Venice didn't see this as corruption. It saw it as protection. Short leadership terms, complex electoral systems, layered councils, harsh penalties for extremes. The goal wasn't democracy in the modern sense. It was system stability. Most medieval governments saw money as a seasonal tool. They collected taxes, looted when desperate, borrowed when cornered. Venice reversed this logic. Instead of borrowing in panic, it borrowed by design. When the state needed funds to build ships, defend trade routes, or wage war, it didn't seize wealth. It issued something called prestiti, forced loans from its wealthiest citizens. On paper, this looked oppressive. In practice, it was revolutionary. The state promised regular interest payments. These claims were tradable. A coerced contribution quietly transformed into an asset. For the first time, citizens weren't just subjects of the state. They were its creditors. And when you hold the government's debt, your incentives change. You want the state to survive. You want stability. You want predictable policy. Chaos stops being romantic and becomes expensive. Venice didn't stumble into this. It understood exactly what it was doing. Debt wasn't a burden. It was a social contract, a way to bind elite wealth directly to the system's survival. The wealthier you were, the more you were invested in Venice's continuity. Political loyalty was secured not through fear, but through returns. But debt alone wasn't enough. Venice also needed money to move efficiently across seas filled with pirates, storms, and rival powers, without physically transporting gold. So Venice did another radical thing. It separated money from metal. In 1587, the city established the Banco Giro, a state-controlled bank designed not to speculate, but to provide stability. Deposits weren't piles of coins stacked in vaults. They were ledger entries, numbers recorded and transferred through trusted institutions. To a modern audience, this seems obvious. To a medieval one, it was almost heretical. Money had always been physical, tangible, heavy, vulnerable. By turning money into accounting, Venice made it lighter, faster, and safer. Merchants could settle debts without moving a single coin. Fraud dropped, disputes decreased, trade accelerated. This wasn't innovation for innovation's sake. It was risk management. The system Venice built never disappeared. It migrated. As Venice declined, its ideas migrated to Amsterdam, where merchants developed public debt markets, to London, where the state learned to borrow permanently, not intermittently, to New York, where finance detached even further from physical constraints. Different cities, same logic. Today, nations don't dominate because they hold the most gold. They dominate because markets believe they'll honor their obligations. Government bonds aren't backed by metal. They're backed by confidence. Central banks don't just manage interest rates. They manage belief. When people say financial system, what they really mean is a network of promises that everyone agrees to treat as real. That agreement is fragile. Money doesn't speak, history speaks. Venice knew this. That's why it enforced discipline. That's why it punished breaches of trust ruthlessly. That's why it kept finance deliberately boring. Modern systems often forget this lesson. Today, debt expands faster than accountability. Risk is privatized in good times, socialized when things break. Fiscal credibility is stretched, patched, reassured, and occasionally papered over with new promises. How stable is a functioning system when it requires constant intervention to convince people it's working? Over time, Venice's prudence turned into rigidity. Its elites became conservative, protectionist, and resistant to change. Innovation slowed. New trade routes bypassed the city. The stability that made Venice powerful eventually made it inflexible. The system survived, but the empire stagnated. That's part of the lesson, too. Money systems don't just collapse when they fail. Sometimes they rot when they succeed too well. When preserving the structure becomes more important than adapting it. Venice mastered money by respecting its limits. It failed when it forgot to evolve them. The deep truth Venice left behind is uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Money is never neutral. It reflects who is trusted, who is protected, and who swallows the losses when trust breaks. Trust-based systems can create extraordinary stability, but only if accountability is real and discipline is enforced. Empires don't fall when they run out of money. They fall when people stop believing the money means something. Venice didn't conquer the world with armies. It shaped it by organizing incentives better than anyone alive. It turned trust into infrastructure, debt into loyalty, finance into governance. And whether we acknowledge it or not, we still live inside the architecture it designed.